everyone. How many of you are planning on trying Tevis this year? Excellent. How many of you, I know a bunch of you already have, how many of you have done it before and or buckled? Yay, okay. So these are kind of some high points that are pulled from a bunch of different lectures about different things that are going to help you get your horse prepared for the ride, help your horse with a couple of small details during the ride, and then maybe just a couple of things afterwards to help your horse recover after the ride. Now, one of the things, and this seems like a real no-brainer, but one of the most important things that you can do between now and showing up at Roby, don't show up with a tired horse. Seems like a no-brainer, but especially after you come and you're kind of in the military, in the Navy, they call it channel fever. When you're almost back to home port and you're really excited and you got all kinds of plans of what you're going to do, it's really easy to get over ambitious with taking your horse out and going, okay, we did that, and by golly, I'm gonna do 150 miles a week, and we're gonna do a bunch of hills, and we're gonna do a whole bunch of fast sprints and things like that. In the next month, your horse is not a large human. I know sometimes they act that way, but you are not going to be able to put on any appreciable amount of conditioning in the next 30 days. What you can do, make sure that you show up with a horse that is in good weight, that maybe he's got a nice full fuel tank, he doesn't have any underlying inflammation in his legs from just working too hard the last couple of weeks before a ride. And now, before I actually pulled in here, I drove around camp and I just kind of took a quick look. One of my master's degrees was in equine exercise physiology. And this was in the 90s. I collected data here at Tevis for about 3 years. We ended up with eventually almost 1,000 data points. And what we were looking at was the relative fatness of horses and how well they did during the ride. And we measured a whole bunch of other things, cannon bone circumference and the weight of the rider and all kinds of different things like that. But what it turned out was that the more we did the statistics, we found out that if you bring a thin horse to Tevis, and I mean a horse that when you stop for fuel somewhere along the 5 or on your way home, if you have to explain to somebody that these are extreme athletes and that's why they look like a greyhound or a walking hat rack, your horse is way too thin. We found out that, and this was a lot more prevalent 30, 40 years ago, you would see these horses really thin because that works in other sports, including human ultra marathons. In horses, that's not true. Their energetics is entirely different than it is in other species. And we found out that a horse that is in what they call a body condition score of 5, it runs on a scale of 1. 1 is a horse that is abused and incredibly emaciated, a walking skeleton. 9 is a flotation device with hair. Right in the middle, you want a horse that you should be able to not see the ribs, but you should be able to easily feel ribs. You should have a nice round butt without having, that gullet down the middle that you could fill with water and raise mosquito fish. You don't want that, but you want nice level across the back. There's a whole bunch of online resources that you can do to look up body condition scoring in horses. But we found out that in general in Tevis, the average completion rate runs right around 47 to 50%, right around in there. Well, it turns out that if you break that down based on the thinness or relative fatness, although you don't want to start with a truly fat horse, those completion rates change. It turns out that the horses that were looking pretty waspy waisted and looking like a greyhound, and they have, this peak behind, if you're standing right behind them, and you can kind of see that top line, it's a little bony, and those kind of horses that look too much like a greyhound, those horses had a completion rate 0. The horses that have a completion rate, have a condition score of about 4.5 to 5, where you can't, like, say, standing from here to this rig over here, the white camper. If I look over there, I don't want to see ribs. I actually don't want to really even see ribs, like maybe from here to right over here with the Frenchie. If they're walking past and it's in strong sunlight, maybe if the horse is wet, you want to just maybe get the hint of ribs moving underneath the skin, and you should be able to easily feel the ribs, but you should not be able to look at that horse cross camp and kind of go, that horse needs some groceries. The completion rate of the 1,000 points that we gathered over about 3 years or so, 3, 4, we did it quite a lot. I published the data from 3 years, and that was about 600 horses. The completion rate of those horses was about 90%. All other things being equal. It didn't matter if it was a little tiny hiney rider, if it was a heavier rider, shall we say famine-resistant rider. Didn't matter what the weight of the rider was in relationship to the horse. Remember that back then, that was the year that Chris Knock won the ride 2 years in a row, and didn't he also win Hagen Cup? Was that 1 year or both years? Did he just, okay, anyway, he did incredibly well. And he was riding a horse named Sachs. That horse carried about 30% of its own weight. Now, granted, Chris also probably, he swore he was not going to run alongside that horse, but I'm sure that he probably did do a lot of footwork. But still, if you bring a horse that is in good condition, then your chances of completion just moved up that much higher. So when I was going through camp, most of the horses here looked pretty good. I saw a couple of horses here that, you know what, if that horse is going to try doing Tevis this year or any 100, what that horse needs to be doing for the next month is basically just going out for some leg stretchers and eating a whole bunch of food. Doesn't necessarily mean you want to be changing their diet and all of a sudden piling a bunch of food in front of them that they're not used to, but just don't be trying to burn off those calories. Now, let's talk about getting the horse actually to Roby and then having yourself prepped for the next day. One of the things that we've found out with various research projects over the past 30, 40 years is that we have underestimated the amount of fluids that horses lose on the way to base camp. And we've also overestimated how well horses are going to rehydrate themselves overnight before the start the next morning. In general, there was a really good Australian study that measured, even if you have the most fantastic rolling palace on wheels, very experienced horses that just don't care about trailering. They're not the ones that are tap dancing and sweating and getting all excited. In ambient temperature, which means like 65 degrees, 70, something like that, well ventilated, those horses are still going to lose about 0.9 gallons of fluid per hour of travel. So that means that if your horse, and he's going to become 1% dehydrated for every 90 minutes of travel. And that's pretty much regardless of what anything you can do. You can do things like, you know, try and stop for water breaks and different things like that. Tremendous difference. That horse is still going to be losing about 0.9 gallons for every hour of trailer travel. So imagine that it's really easy to spend 8 hours on the road getting to a ride. That means that when that horse steps off the trailer at base camp, he's already 5% dehydrated. Now, 5% is the average dehydration of most horses after a 50-mile ride. Now, what's really interesting is that that's also, most horses are about 5% dehydrated at the end of a 25-mile ride and at the end of a 100-mile ride. And that's because of the way that the thirst mechanism works in horses. Most horses are generally, there's some things you can do to kind of trick their thirst mechanism, but a lot of horses are not going to take their first good drink until they've already been out working for 15, 17, 18, 20, even 25 miles. Hopefully with experience, then there's things that you can do to get them to start drinking better, faster, and earlier. But in general, that thirst response doesn't really start to kick in until about 25 miles. So keep that in mind with your ride strategy, not just here at Tevis, but at any ride. That also means that those horses tend to drink enough to offset their fluid losses between 25 and 50 miles. And then at 50 miles and on, hopefully you've kind of gotten to the point where this is about the time of the evening that a lot of riders are going to be into Forest Hill. It's starting to cool down. The horses have had a chance to rest. You've got a bunch of downhills. Those damn canyons are finally behind you. And there's lots of things that you can do. And there's a lot of horses that are experienced. They know that they're in the home stretch, relatively speaking. They start drinking better, they start eating better. And so a lot of those horses at the finish line will be the same level of dehydration as they were when you stepped off your trailer just a couple days earlier. Now the other thing is that we tend to overestimate how well horses will drink and rehydrate themselves overnight on Friday. And we think all we have to do is just hang a 2-gallon bucket off the side of your trailer and they'll be fine. No, they don't. This was Dr. Gillespie's work. I helped with that for a while. A whole bunch of people helped with that. And we measured horses before they went to base camp, and then we measured them as soon as they got off the trailer, and then we measured them the next morning before the start, and then we measured them throughout the day and after the finish. And we found that those horses were still starting rides not fully hydrated. One of the projects that I did, this was, I don't know, early 2000s, something like that, is that I pulled blood on a research group of horses at Roby and then at Robinson's Forest Hill in the finish line, and I found the same thing. 60% of the starting pack at Tevis of those horses did not start the ride hydrated. Now, if ever there was a ride where a horse needs to start the course hydrated, this is the one. So there's a couple things that you can do the night before or the day before, depending on when you get to Roby, to help your horse get more hydrated. One, remember that horses are still a prey species. They don't like buckets that look like head traps. So even if he's been drinking out of a 2-gallon or a 5-gallon bucket his entire career, horses will drink 10% more water if their eyes never have to go below the rim of the bucket. They don't like things that are hanging. So if you've always had even a 5-gallon bucket and you hang it off the side of your trailer, they will not drink as well as they will if they have some great big open muck bucket that they can get their head down into. That also means there's that much more water that they have to drink before their eyes go below that rim. And one good trick that Jamie Kerr recommended years ago, and I think it's great, is that you can take the inside of a muck bucket and don't use it for anything else. Don't use it for chemicals or for washing your car or for, putting poop into it, things like that. Keep that for nothing but water and keep it clean. I know horses will drink out of a mud puddle when they're out on the trail, but still, give them clean water. One of the things you can do is measure the inside with a Sharpie so that you go, okay, at this level, up here, a muck bucket, one of the big ones with the rope handles, those hold about 16 gallons. If it's down like this much, okay, that's about 14 gallons. This is 12 gallons, this is 10 gallons. You can look at that, if you top that up, and you should absolutely keep that thing full. The next morning you come out and you go, okay, there's where the level is now. I know I was completely topped up the night before. Now it's down to here. He drank 4 gallons overnight. That's a useful number for you to have. So I really recommend that instead of having just a bucket hanging off the side of your trailer, have one of the great big muck bucket type things. Make sure it stays clean. I know a lot of our horses have a sense of humor and they will aim so that they can poop in their own water bucket. Make sure it's clean before you go to bed. If you do want to have something hanging off the side of the trailer or have a second bucket, you might want to consider having a brine bucket. Now this is something that is just getting more electrolytes into your horse. And I know that it's a huge thing and there's a really wide range of opinions about electrolyting in horses. Some people think that it is the bee's knees and you got to be getting electrolytes into those horse every opportunity you can by hook or by crook. Other people think that it's poison. You can come to your own conclusions. I don't think you should probably really change your protocol now. You know, don't go doing something new at Tevis, except hopefully picking up a buckle. But what you can do, salt is the only mineral that horses will develop a specific appetite for. And they will eat as much as they need or drink or ingest or whatever to replenish their salt deficit. They won't overdo it themselves. It's very, very rare that horses will do that, but it's really hard. Once they're behind the power curve, it's hard for them to catch up during a ride, which is why I like, personally, my horse gets syringed. But one thing you can do is, if you think about it yourself, say that you're exercising and you know you got some electrolytes deficit and you need to get some electrolytes into you. Would you rather take a couple of salt tablets and eat those and crunch those up and hope they stay down and you don't get too nauseated? Or would you rather dilute it and drink some sort of electrolyte drink that has some salt and electrolytes in it? Your horse feels the same way. It is much more likely that if he discovers, and this is something you can practice during the next month, a lot of the times it's also a matter of habit. If you use the same color bucket every single time, horses will start to look for that bucket. And one of the colors that horses see the best is blue. So what you can do is you can fill up a bucket with water. You can put a fair amount of salt into it, even if it's way more salty than a horse would, you know, normally want to drink just for fun or something. Once they've got that salt appetite, say you've got a 5-gallon bucket, put a half cup or a cup of salt into it. Kosher salt tends to dissolve better than just regular table salt does. Art King, he was at a FEI event in Florida, and we had kind of been talking about that, and he said, you know, this next ride, I'm going to give that a try and just offer a bucket of really salty water to, you know, our horses and just see if they want it. We're not going to force it, we'll just offer it to them. Well, they kind of misunderstood, and there's a little miscommunication with the amount of water and the amount of salt, and they had, well, it was about probably 2 or 3 gallons, and instead of dissolving about a cup, somehow what got dissolved was about 2 pounds. And they were planning on then, you know, dividing it up to other buckets and adding more water, but one of the horses kind of went, hey, what you got there? And he went over there, and they just kind of, oh, you want some of this? And he just about drained that thing. And they were kind of like, holy cow, is this horse about to like shrivel up into a little raisin and drop dead? The horse did great. He was bright, he was perky, he was happy. He went on, he drank a whole bunch of fresh water, he ate like a bear, went on and did a great day. Now, I'm not recommending that you try and get 2 pounds of salt into your horse, but what I'm saying is that horses will develop a specific appetite. So that is something for you to consider to have available to them, not only at Roby, but at the vet checks where you have a crew that can come and meet you. Just have a bucket. I mean, you're going to go to the regular troughs when you come on in, but when you're going out and you're at your crew place and your horse is eating and you've got this smorgasbord out there, you want to have a bucket of fresh water, but also maybe have some salt water, some brine available for him as well. If he wants it, great. If he doesn't, okay. But at least you've made that available. The question was, how do we check hydration? A ride vet is going to look at a whole bunch of different parameters because there is no single test that you can look at that says this horse is 5% dehydrated. The best way to do that is the same way that Chris was saying they do it on the Western States run. They weigh you. Because the odds are good, most of the weight that you have lost between point A and point B is going to be fluids. So, and that was how we measured hydration as well. We had a portable scale that we were schlepping from point A to point B.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
So, but when the ride vets, that's why they're looking at so many different parameters, and almost every single parameter has to do with hydration. And every horse that is going to get pulled, 99% of those horses has to do with hydration deficits, even the horses that are lame. Because a dehydrated horse is a tired horse. A tired horse is a klutzy horse. A klutzy horse is one that's going to find that rock with his name on it and is going to trip and go down or do something, and that horse is more likely to be lame. Plus, lame horses, you could have all kinds of muscle myopathy issues, things like that. All of that goes back to hydration. But the ride vets are going to be looking at things like the capillary refill, at the meeting pulse parameters, at gut sounds, looking at the jug fill, skin tenting. There's all kinds of things that we tend to look at. Okay, feeding your horse right before the ride. It seems almost intuitive that when your alarm goes off on Saturday morning, you want to go out there and you want to give your horse a really high energy breakfast because he's going to be working really hard that day and he needs those calories. That's actually the wrong way to do it. The reason why is that if you feed your horse a high glycemic meal, say on 4 a.m. on Saturday morning, he's going to eat that. His blood glucose levels are going to spike just about the time that you actually hit the Tevis trail. How many people here that have done Tevis or started any other endurance ride felt at the very beginning of the ride, gee, I wish my horse was perkier and had more energy? Pretty rare. Now, the other thing that happens is that when you have that spike in blood glucose, the pancreas, its job is to take high blood glucose, take it out of circulation, and put it into storage. That's the pancreas's job, among other things. When it does that by releasing a whole bunch of insulin. So you're going to get a blood glucose spike, and right after that, you're going to get an insulin spike. Insulin is going to pull that glucose out of circulation, but it has another effect at the same time. Now, the diesel fuel of endurance energetics for horses is burning volatile fatty acids, free fatty acids. And there is a particular, a whole different energetics pathways that is required to be able to utilize that particular pathway. Insulin shuts down that energy pathway. So if you have an insulin spike, then A, that blood glucose is being taken away, so it's no longer available for energy. But at the same time, it's basically shut down that fuel line of diesel fuel that you need to be able to fuel your horse during exercise all day long. Now, it lasts for, say, call it around 6-7 hours, something like that. It goes up, it spikes, and then it has a long gradual decline again. But our horses get an awful lot of work done in 6 hours. You do not want to be pinching off that energy pathway by feeding them a high glycemic meal that morning that he doesn't need. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't want to start your horse with a full fuel tank, but you don't have to fill that gas tank that morning. You fill it the day before. So what you want to do is get to base camp, get yourself set up, go out for whatever tack ride, loosen up your horse, and then go ahead and give him a nice sloppy mash that he will finish no later than midnight. Now, that you're still going to get that same glucose spike, the bugs love me tonight, you're still going to get that same glucose spike and that same insulin spike, but we don't care because your horse is just standing tied to the trailer. We're not asking him to do anything. So that's okay. But at the same time that the pancreas is releasing the insulin, that insulin is taking that blood glucose and is putting it into muscles where you'll be able to use it the next day or the day after or whatever. Now, the morning of the ride, what do you want to feed your horse for breakfast? Well, your horse should have been standing knee-deep in hay all night long. And even if you know that he normally only eats 10 pounds of hay at home, you don't want that horse having to dig down to the bottom of a hay bag to get out every last little crumb. Waste the hay. Even with hay prices right now, fine, it's going to cost you $5, $7, $10 in wasted hay that you're leaving behind. So what? You want to make sure that that horse is absolutely gone through and packed in as much forage as possible for the previous 2-3 days. Because there's a general rule of thumb that what your horse is eating on Wednesday and Thursday is what he's going to be burning for energy on Saturday. So that whole week before the ride, make sure that horse is up to his eyebrows in forage. So the next morning on Saturday, what do you feed him for breakfast? Feed him a flake of fresh hay. It may be exactly the same hay that he's been standing in all night long or rolling around on or peeing on, but fresh hay is good hay. So give him another flake of hay. You can still give him a little bit of breakfast if your horse is the type that he's going to pout if he doesn't get something. But just don't make it a high glycemic. And by glycemic, I mean something that has a lot of sweet feed to it, that is one of the so-called competition feeds. You don't want to feed him anything that has, say like beet pulp that has, and they all have molasses to them, even if they say that they don't have molasses added, they do. If you're going to feed him beet pulp, make sure you've completely soaked it down and then rinsed it at least a couple of times so you've taken all that molasses out of it. You can feed him a handful or so of that. You can feed him a handful or so of maybe like some alfalfa pellets that you've completely soaked down into mush. You can feed him a couple of carrots, not a lot of carrots. Don't put a whole bucket in front of him. He doesn't need it, and even that tends to cause a little bit of an issue. But you can give him a little bit of something just to convince him that you still love him and he should not try and kill you that day. Now, when do you start feeding your horse high glycemic meals? You can start doing that about 10 miles into any ride. For Tevis, by the time you get up to high camp, that's usually the time that a lot of these horses, they'll start to take their first pretty good drink. You might want to jump off and, you're adjusting tack or doing whatever you have to do. And a lot of the times that's a good time to start offer them a couple bites of food. Go ahead and feed them the sweet feed. Almost the sweeter the better. You're not going to have the same glucose and insulin spikes because the exercise itself blunts that insulin spike. And you do want to kind of keep their blood glucose up during the day. You don't want to do this and only do it at the major vet checks. There is a particular syndrome that you will get some very large fluid shifts from the plasma, which is the watery portion of blood. It's in the blood circulation, and that's out there, and that's what's transporting oxygen and waste products and glucose and all the things that you need to get those muscles going. That fluid can shift from the water, from the blood circulation into the GI tract in response to what they call large episodic meals. By episodic, that means meals that are more than about 2 or 3 hours apart. By large, it means meals that are larger than about, say, 2 pounds dry weight. You don't want that fluid shift happening if you only feed your horse at Robinson's or at Forest Hill. Now, there's lots and lots of smaller checks along the way, and you definitely want to make sure that your horse gets at least a couple of bites in there as well. But carry along some food with you, and every time you stop for water, just make sure, basically every hour, you should offer your horse at least a couple bites of something. Some little baggie of a really wet sweet feed. Don't feed dry feed. One of the first physiologic pathways in the body to shut down in response to progressive dehydration is saliva production. And that starts to happen when the horse is only about 2% dehydrated. And we can't identify a horse that's 2%, but the odds are good that a lot of the horses that start Tevis or start any ride are still 2% dehydrated. So they're not producing as much saliva as they would. If you start throwing in some dry feed in there when he's even more dehydrated along the trail, what are your chances of happening? You're increasing what possibility? That he's going to choke. You can prevent that by just always feeding something that is wet, preferably sloppy, including along the trail. Never, ever, ever feed any kind of pellets or cubes during a ride, and preferably for a long time after the ride. Again, because a lot of people will say that it's beet pulp is the feed that's most likely to cause choke in horses, whether at a ride or not. It's not. It's pellets and cubes. It's just that beet pulp tends to usually be fed as a pelleted form. So it kind of, gets blamed for that when it's more of the form that it's fed in that is the problem. So these fluid shifts, if you do only feed your horse, say that you kind of skip the food at the gate and go checks, and you only feed your horse and they really pork it and eat a whole bunch of food at Robinson's and at Forest Hill. What kind of fluid shifts are we talking about? We're talking about 15 to 20% of their plasma volume, which is about a gallon of water that's being pulled directly out of blood circulation. So if you have a horse that is already, say, 5% dehydrated, or he's kind of having a rough go and he's not drinking as well as he should be, lots of other things going on, if that horse is already dehydrated, that extra gallon of temporarily unavailable fluids can be enough to push that horse over the edge into metabolic failure. So feed your horse along the trail. Don't count on there being any grass on the trail. It's amazing. For those of you that live in this area, you'll know that about 8 weeks ago, it was green as Ireland here. It was absolutely gorgeous. And the forest orchids were out, and it was just absolutely beautiful. And that's where we all go out and take the pictures of how beautiful it is. And then it gets hot, and we don't have any more rain, and just like that, things turn brown overnight. So you're not going to find any kind of forage along the trail itself, but there will absolutely be hay for you at every single one of the vet checks, and there's a whole bunch of them along the way. Now, time management is a big deal at Tevis. So you don't want to be taking a lot of extra time. Could your horse benefit by taking an extra 15 minutes to stop and eat because they've got the hay at whatever stop that you've got? Absolutely. You don't have that kind of time to waste. But what you can do instead, and I've seen when I've vetted Tevis a couple of years ago, you'll see even the top hot shoes that they will be doing the same thing, is that every single vet check that you come to, the vets will go ahead, they'll check your horse, check the pulse, check his metabolics, and then they will give you back your card, and then they're going to have you trot away from them, headed down the trail.
That's what we need to know. Okay, is there anything else we need? No, don't think so. You got
Time you came in?
Yep, which is 1600. That way.
I think we're good. Okay,
Thank you.
I propped the cones up for you.
And we're trying to report the time they came in. Kind of good. There was one that was 102.5 and one that was 101. Mine was 101.
And assuming that they don't shriek at you to turn around and come back because they saw something, that means that you are good to go. Usually you turn around, look at them, and they kind of go, okay, you're good. Unless it's your friends that are vetting and you're riding, in which case they'll all stand there like this for a while and just to kind of screw with you. So at the end, there will always be another trough of water, and there's also going to be hay and feed and rider foods and things like that. You still don't want to necessarily take the time to stop for 10, 15 minutes to let your horse eat, but you can pick up a pound or so of alfalfa, and either you can carry like a little plastic grocery bag in one of your packs, and you can cram it in there, and throw some water on top of it so it's wet. Never throw hay into the main water trough because it turns into compost, and the people behind you will hunt you down and kill you. But you can get that hay wet, and then you will actually feel better if you walk or jog alongside your horse for about a quarter mile or so right out of the vet check. At least that is true for me, and it's been true for a lot of friends that I've talked to. Keep handing your horse hay as you're moving on down the trail. You're still making forward progress. You're getting another couple pounds of hay into your horse. You're stretching out your own legs. You're using different muscle groups. By the time you get down there and you finish out the hay, take your little plastic bag, cram it back into your packs. There's always rocks out there for you to climb on and use as a mounting block. Get it into the saddle and you're on your way. Your horse will do incredibly better if you have that constant amount of hay. Even if you only get like a big handful, maybe a pound of hay at each of those checks, that's an extra 8, 9, almost 10 pounds of hay into your horse by the time you get to Auburn. So that and carrying some baggies of feed with you in the trail really help your horses a lot. Calcium. One of the things that you will have noticed today doing those canyons, there's a lot of downhill, but there's a whole bunch of uphill. Uphill burns up a whole lot of calcium in those muscles. And a lot of those horses, the place that you were most likely to start seeing some muscle cramping or those little tiny muscle fasciculations is coming up and out of that third canyon right just before you come into Michigan Bluff. One thing is going to help with that is calcium. Now that is not just a calcium deficiency, because you do also need to be getting other electrolytes into your horse along the whole way, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But getting some extra calcium into your horse throughout the day, in addition to whatever alfalfa he's eaten the night before and that you've been able to hand to him during the day, will help with that. And you want to try and get about, if you can, 20 grams of calcium. You can do that with 50 of the extra strength Tums tablets. Now you can also do things like, CMPK, but that's one more thing you got to be syringing into your horse, and they don't really like it, and they're tired of you messing with their mouth. This tends to be a really variable thing, but a lot of horses really like the peppermint Tums. My horse used to think that those were candy, and you could hand them out to him like a treat, and he would just gobble them out of your hand and go looking for more. This year, of course, now he's decided they're poison, so we're going to have to do something else. If you offer your horse Tums and he says, nope, not happening, those are really easy to grind up and just put the equivalent of a couple of Tums tablets into each of those little wet baggies of feed that you're handing your horse in between. You may not get the full 20 grams into him, but whatever you can get in there. That particular form of calcium doesn't tend to have a lot of flavor. It's not offensive to them. They're not gonna, you don't have to be syringing it into their mouth, things like that, but it does really help with getting a little bit more calcium into them. Okay, let's just talk a little tiny bit about electrolyting. And I will tell you what I tend to do and some of the things that we know physiologically, because some of this is just plain math. In general, on average, horses are going to lose about an ounce of electrolytes, primarily through sweating, for every hour of exercise on the trail. And that's in pretty ambient temperature. That's not high humidity. That's not the 100 degrees that you've got going on down in the canyons. That's just on average. So if you are, the main pack of completers, that means your horse is very likely to lose anywhere between about 16 to 20 ounces, almost 1.5 pounds of electrolytes throughout the day. Some of that he's going to get back just by eating hay. Hay is a tremendous source of potassium. If you're eating alfalfa, then that's a good source of calcium. If you're feeding them also some of those Tums, that's a good source of calcium as well. But the primary ions that your horse is going to lose is going to be chloride, sodium, and potassium. And your horse is not going to have enough time at checks to eat enough hay to keep up with his potassium losses most of the time. It helps if you're doing that trick where you're handing it out to him along the way. And the only way that he's going to get additional sodium is through some kind of a salt supplement. Now, I was saying earlier that salt is the only mineral that, and I mean specifically sodium, is the only mineral that animals will develop a specific appetite for. You see a lot of sometimes these different supplements that they have like free choice, that they've got cobalt and boron and magnesium and manganese and all kinds of things like that. Doesn't work that way. But that does work for sodium. So just because your horse is losing, say, 16 ounces of salt does not mean that you want to try and replace 16 ounces of salt, because electrolytes are not innocuous. Exactly the same thing as you, even if you knew that you were really deficient in electrolytes, if somebody said, here's a whole handful of salt tablets, go ahead and eat them all at once because you need those electrolytes. Are those going to help you out? No. It's going to make you really nauseated, and I guarantee within probably 10 to 20 minutes, you're going to be getting a second look at them. Same thing for your horse. If you go syringing electrolytes into them and they stop eating, they stop drinking, they just shut down and sit there and look miserable, you've done it wrong. It's not that your horse cannot tolerate electrolytes, you delivered it to him wrong. Think about that, again, if you were electrolyte deficient yourself and your crew said, here, eat this whole handful of salt tablets because you need the salt, that's not going to work. What if, on the other hand, they handed you a bag of potato chips and said, here, eat this? Okay, I'm all about that. You're still getting in a whole bunch of salt, but you're getting it in small little bits. Do it the same way for your horse. You want to use a salt shover, not a salt shaker, not a snow shovel to get salt into your horse. Small, frequent amounts by any means that your horse will tolerate. My horse, I ride a gaited horse. He's heavily muscled. He's about the most atypical horse that you will see out there on any endurance trail, other than that little tiny hackney pony thing. And he goes through a bunch of electrolytes. And I know that he needs them because we've done training rides where I pulled blood at certain times and I knew exactly how deficient he was, and then I dialed in his electrolyte protocol based on that, and then went back and checked it again and went, yep, that's what he needs. Not all horses are like that. But if you can basically get your horse to eat the equivalent of a bag of potato chips instead of trying to jam things down his throat once or twice during the ride, you're going to help out your horse. Most of the time, instead of giving your horse, say if you wanted to give your horse 8 ounces of electrolytes during the day, you're going to have problems if you try and get 8 ounces, one 8-ounce dose into him, or even 2 4-ounce doses into him. You want to break that up more into 16 half-ounce doses, because that's snacking on a bag of potato chips, not the handful of salt tablets. The other thing is that even though you know that your horse is maybe going to go through 16 or 20 ounces, he's going to lose that much salt during the day, you don't want to try and replace all of it. There's been some really good research done on this, and the recommendations is to try and replace somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of what his calculated electrolyte losses are. So if you're planning on being out there and you're going to take 20 hours to do that ride, and I guarantee you your horse is going to be sweating the whole time, then it's probably a pretty good calculation that your horse is probably going to lose about 20 ounces of electrolytes. You'll be able to replace some of that with feeding him at the checks, but you don't want to try and replace that 20 ounces. Half of that would be 10. 1/3 of that would be what, somewhere around 7, something like that. 7 ounces of salt is not that much if you're breaking it up into 10, 12, 16 doses. Again, you can add just the tiniest pinch of it, and I do mean a pinch, because horses don't always like a whole bunch of salt in their that baggie of feed. And if he goes, nope, too much salt, not eating it, well, now he's also not getting the food. But you can add a little bit of salt to that baggie of feed. You can have that brine bucket at Robinson's and at Forest Hill and the night before. You can have that beside the brine bucket, have just some plain salt available to him in a pan at the checks where your crew can bring it in for you. If you are going to electrolyte your horse with a syringe, then do it in small doses. Personally, what I do for John Henry is I use a brand out there that has been formulated specifically for endurance horses, not just like an apple a day or something like that. A lot of those have bicarb and they don't have the right ratios in them. I use Enduramax. I like the research behind it, and that's what my horse gets. I mix it up in a ratio by volume where there's 1 ounce by volume of the powder with anywhere between 1 to 3 ounces of a buffer. And I use kale and pectin. It works really well for me as a buffer. I have not noticed that it does anything to block electrolyte absorption, at least based on the blood work I did with my own 1-rat research. Seemed to work really well for him, and it works well as a buffer. There's lots of other things out there that you can use as a buffer. Some people like yogurt, some people like applesauce. I don't like anything that's going to spoil in the heat. But use something that is going to help that horse as that salt hits his tummy. And again, try and aim for that, feeding him a bag of potato chips as opposed to handing him a whole handful of salt tablets. At the end of the ride, they will have, as soon as you do your victory lap and you cross underneath the banner at McCann Stadium, they're going to have a whole bunch of hay out there for you. Most of it is going to be dry hay, and your horses are going to be hungry, and they're going to want to go over there and grab a great big mouthful of that dry hay. My horse did that the very first time that I finished, and he promptly choked right then and there after we had already gone underneath the banner but had not yet done our completion check. So there I am, very busily kicking myself because I allowed him to do that because we were too busy jumping up and down and hugging each other. I was lucky because he cleared it himself and he didn't have to be treated. But even at that point, if your horse has to be treated for a choke, a horse that is choking because of that esophageal obstruction is not fit to continue. And that is likely a horse that is not going to be given a completion because that horse is not okay to go on. So when you cross that finish line, go ahead and feed him, before you go ahead and want to do your completion check, but have your crew meet you with some wet hay. Even if they just grab a couple big handfuls of it, dunk it in your own bucket of hay, and then put that in front of the horse. It's one extra thing just to make sure that now's not the time for the gremlins to get you, because Tevis gremlins don't go to sleep as soon as at the start. Those things are active all year. After you've gone through and you've finished, and hopefully, and you've taken your horse back to your rig or into their stall or wherever it is, let him just eat forage for at least the first hour. Have a brine bucket out for him, have fresh water for him. It's still a little too early, in my opinion. Other vets have different opinions. I don't like putting a lot of simple carbohydrates into them at that point. I think what they need is hydration, and they need gut motility, and you're going to do that with forage. Forage also drives the thirst response, so if your horse is eating a bunch of hay, he's going to drink better. After about an hour, you can go ahead and you can start to give him a really sloppy mash. If your horse is the type that he says, nope, he won't eat a sloppy mash, he wants it dry or nothing, then he doesn't get a mash. He does not get anything dry for a minimum of 24 hours after the ride, because even overnight, no matter how well he is drinking, that horse is not going to rehydrate himself back to where he needs to be. On average, it takes about 2 days for horses to rehydrate themselves. Keep that in mind before you plan on when you're going to load that horse up and take him home. Are you doing the best thing you could in managing your horse by loading him up the next morning and saying, that's it, I'm out of here, we're on our way home, and yeah, it's 12 hours on our way back to Utah or Nevada or wherever it is, but keep in mind your horse is still dehydrated and he's tired, so plan your week so that you give that horse plenty of time to rehydrate and refuel so that he is up for that trip back on going home again. That's what I've got. I'm happy to answer some questions if anybody's got some. Yes, ma'am.
You know what you said on, so if you're closer, if you're a couple hours or something, that it's better to take them home fairly quickly, so then they're
The
fine.
question is, if you're within a couple hours of home, is it better to go ahead and take them home? In my opinion, no. And I live less than a half hour away from the fairgrounds. My horse will still stay at the fairgrounds for at least 24 hours because he deserves to rest and eat and have somebody that is checking on him constantly, have a lot of eyes on them, because we all know from endurance horses, just because they've crossed the finish line and they've gotten their finish check and they've gotten their 2-hour safety check doesn't mean that they're all of a sudden invincible. Lots of things can happen. I've always kind of wondered when people say, oh, I'm just going to take him home and he's going to be able to relax. Okay, are you saying that the horse is going to be able to relax? Or you're going to be able to relax because you've turned him out in the pasture and you assume he's out there and he's resting and taking care of himself. In the meantime, you've gone inside and you've cracked a beer and taken a long hot shower and you're going to bed. There's nobody out there checking on your horse every 15 minutes. So that's my opinion, but no. I think that your horse deserves
24 hours at least.
They really do. And I totally get it that life goes on and there's lots of other things we, have to do, but just bear in mind, I mean, if, say, the next morning after Tevis, or, okay, most of us finish in the morning, say that night right after the barbecue, somebody said, okay, we're saddling up and we're gonna go ride 25 miles. How enthusiastic are you gonna be about that? Same thing. Okay, so I love that question. The question is, when we're talking about carrying along a little baggie of food to feed them along the trail, are we talking the little snack baggies? Are we talking a sandwich bag? I usually do the quart size freezer bag because they're not gonna all eat that. A bunch of it is gonna get slobbered on the floor. The horse next to you is gonna swing around and knock you over, some of it's, whatever. So if I have that much, then, probably only about a half of that baggie is the actual dry feed, and then you've added some water to it. So a lot of that is just water weight to it, and it'll go like this. So I tend to go for the big heavy-duty freezer bags and do not the ones that you have to go like this to close it, because those things are impossible when you've got wet gloves on, or I always ride with gloves. Yeah, do the ones that have the actual Ziploc. Exactly. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it. Good luck with everyone's ride this year, regardless of the ride you're doing.